Mr. Luber's out walking his dog. Tyler Murphy, Michelle, Javier Rivera, Chetan, the beautiful Chetan. Hey, Rivera, tell me about self-deception and Nietzsche and stuff. I liked your presentation because now I'm thinking about self-deception being what the individual, like, is self-deception needed so that we can engage in self-teaching? Because we have to warm ourselves up to new topics. And if we take it all at once, it was overwhelming. So I'm thinking about the relation between self-deception and self-teaching. And so what's your thoughts on your presentation today, Mr. Rivera? Talk about it for a minute. It's good to see you, sir.
I have to get ready for work, but like, yeah, it's like, I've been really thinking about this because I'm like, well, think about money, right? Like, I was like, yeah, money, like it's such an abstract thing, but it was like such a necessary deception to even make the world like a globalized like economy. And like, so we have to feed each other this myth of like money and like value and like capital and investment to like function. But then like the thing that Nietzsche is like pointing out that I'm still struggling to think through, which is like, okay, so when do we need to create a new deception to belong?
It muted you. I don't know why. That was weird.
That's weird.
Okay, there you are.
Okay. I don't even know where I cut off.
You were talking about how much you love your job and how you're glad about the fetish of capital that gives you this opportunity to participate in a collective deception or something.
Yeah. So
a new deception.
Yeah. So I was thinking like, okay, so when will we demand or need a new deception? And like, I think much of like Nietzsche's conversation is, well, when we go to like the will to power, like nihilism is necessary to go through. And like, I'm starting to think like Nietzsche really does think in cycles, because he's going like, okay, once man discovers the value that he thought he had, he falls into a state of like pessimism, basically. And he really is responding to a lot of Schopenhauer's pessimism in like the world at the time. But then he's like, what's weird about it is like, it's necessary to go through this sickness, this isolation, this alienation. So like even the meaning crisis that we're talking about, like Nietzsche would say, well, it's because we need to do this because we're recovering. We're in a state of convalescence. But our mode of self-preservation is precisely this. And I think you can find this in The Birth of Tragedy, which I still think he's consistent in, which is we need a new myth of like being, of belonging. And like this would be Luber's idea too. Like we need a new story, basically, because the story that we have or we previously have is done with. But the problem that I have with this, and it's not so much with Nietzsche, but I'm just like, he doesn't give me the epistemological tools to think through, okay, well, when do we create a new myth versus when do we continue being in the state that we're being? And in some sense, like Nietzsche, he kind of answers this and doesn't answer, because he goes, well, when he talks about in the all too human part, he goes, I invented the idea of free spirits so I wouldn't feel alienated. Right? So clearly there is no demarcation, it seems, but it seems like arbitrary in the sense of when we feel strong enough to recover, we're going to create a new myth. But I guess the discernment here, and this is maybe the wisdom part, is when should we discern when we feel exhausted from being? We should just rest, be alienated, recover, and then create a new myth and belong again. So I don't know. This is like really interesting because like self-deception is like, I see the necessity of it, but then I'm also like, okay, but when do we transition from myth to another myth? And it seems to be contingent, I think, on this predication of, do we feel exhausted or are we strong enough? Because those things can be, because like I think our culture right now is exhaustion is my sign of strength. Like, man, I've been keeping grinding. Like, you don't understand, bro. Like, I'm so tired, but I just keep grinding. You know what I mean? Like, that's the thing that always concerns me, is that exhaustion is mistaken as a sign of strength when perhaps we should rest. So I don't know. I mean, I have so much to think about with Nietzsche on this, but these are just my preliminary thoughts.
I love the idea of exhaustion as a sign of strength. That is outstanding. So as you're on the workplace in a few minutes, Mr. Rivera, never be exhausted. To reverse, to make everyone there reflect that actually in them acting exhausted, they're the weak ones, and do some psycho gymnastics on people. I think that's going to be great. Mr. Jockin, it's good to see you, sir. Everyone sign up for Mr. Jockin's class. It's going to freaking save the world. And I enjoyed your conversation with Dr. Nieberhausen the other day. And Clayton, is good to see you as well. No, that's all outstanding, Javier. So I've been thinking more and more on this question of this kind of self-deception that we seem to need. And I was reading Matthew Stanley's fantastic book that everyone should read on silence, and I'll pass it to Mr. Luber. And he talks about, as we've talked about before, and this comes from Zizek Marx, this idea of objective fictions, like Capital, right? Like, even if you know it's all a fiction, even if you all know it's a social construct, it simply doesn't do to say, therefore, it doesn't affect me. You know, the objective fiction of Capital still impacts you. And I've been reading a lot about the formation of the notion of all these kind of aesthetic phenomenons in history. You could talk about the idea of the cherry blossom with the kamikaze bombers. We talked about that functioned as an objective fiction. Even if what was so interesting on that book is, even if you didn't believe in the empire in Japan, even if you thought it was all nonsense, you were still forced to relate to this symbolic of the cherry blossom that was honorable to be associated with. So it was an objective fiction. So even if you saw it as a collective self-deception, you still couldn't escape it. And even if today you kind of try to escape self-deception too quickly, like, well, let me get out of Capital, well, then you're bankrupt, right? Or maybe you throw away your beliefs so quickly and you're overwhelmed with anxiety. There's also the notion of the formation of the idea of witchcraft in South Africa that was used to control the working classes, because anyone could be a witch at any point, because you decide what actions look like a witch and what don't. And even if you thought it was all insane, the objective fiction of witchcraft still structured you, right? And likewise, and we can keep going through some different examples. The idea, there's another book on the formation of the South as a construct, and in the Reconstruction after the Civil War. That is an objective fiction that, even if you like, that's a silly identity, it still structures you. And what's so very interesting about all this is I wonder increasingly if philosophy is the business of objective fictions. On an analysis of the reality of objective fictions, how do we live with objective fictions, how do we handle objective fictions, which precisely gain in strength with the loss of givens. As givens go away, the power of objective, they're always there. I'm not saying they weren't always there, but the power of objective fiction, Chetan was made aesthetics as violence from a previous neck conversation. All of these seem to really roar into the power vacuum, or the ontological vacuum of not having givens. And they rush in. And one thinks of ontological design by Mr. Frege. One thinks about storytelling by Mr. Luber, and these kind of structures. And then, of course, the question that arises, and let me give it to Mr. Luber and Mr. Jockin. There's more to be said. Well, the example I was going to give from Mr. Stanley's book is in the book and novel Silence. The Christian who, they step on a picture of Christ, that means you're abandoning the faith, right? So that's kind of like this idea. It's the Fjergi, or whatever it's called. I can't pronounce it. It's very interesting because that's an aesthetic act. You step onto an aesthetic, then you look like to the community that you are betraying Christ. And what Stanley is asking is this kind of idea of an inward faith. It's like, yeah, but he's still truly a Christian because inwardly he still believes in Jesus. Well, interesting enough, there's a way in which that's not actually what Christ would have you do, because you're not countering the objective fiction that structures the social reality. You're retreating to a private faith that makes you irrelevant to the objective fiction. And there's a way, what Stanley is suggesting, is that Christ would compel you to stand against the objective fiction. So then a private faith could be a problem. Hey, look, private purposes, private meanings that don't have you participate in some sort of response to the objective fiction that is structuring people, that could be problematic. Oh, but guess what? Lots of sociologists also teach that if you remove the objective fiction too quickly, the self-deception too quickly, the world blows up. Oh, crap. So we have some sort of medical, precise surgical operation by which to deal with objective fictions. Maybe the philosopher is the surgeon of objective fictions, is what I'm thinking more and more about, because philosophy of its sociological character is very new to the 19th century, and that's an excellent question, Chetan, on the difference between an objective fiction and a subjective fiction. I would certainly say that the objective fiction, like capitalism, an objective fiction is a social horizon that works even if you don't believe in it, and it has causal impact on you. So, for example, I think capital is silly. This is a piece of paper called a dollar. That's dumb. And yet my life is still structured by it, right? It still has a causal impact on me, regardless what I subjectively think about it. Whereas maybe a subjective fiction would be, I'm writing a unicorn right now, and I really want to believe it, but alas, crap. Now, what's interesting, of course, is that objective fictions precisely work in a feedback loop to then formulate subjective fictions in line with them, and that is aesthetic power. But whereas objective fictions tend to formulate, at least subconsciously, subjective fictions are less likely to formulate objective fictions without significant political collective action, et cetera, so forth. Not saying it's impossible, but it has to start moving into a communal effort, et cetera. It has to move into kind of the political realm. But then, so then I'll give it Mr. Luber. Is the philosopher, if they are increasingly to be identified with the question of sociology, that as a field really develops, as we've spoken before at the net with Jockin and the birth of anxiety, all these different things with the 19th century, does that mean philosophy today is kind of the surgeon of objective fictions? And then the question is the only way to move beyond objective fictions and not enter chaos the strike of beauty, which would allude to Mr. Jockin's class. But let me give it to Mr. Luber. It is good to see you today, sir. I hope you are doing well.
Thank you, Daniel. I am doing well. I love Ontological Design by Frege. Great book. Big influence on me. And then, yeah, Jockin's course. Can't wait. Just need one check to come in, and then boom, I'm there. I'm excited for that. This to me has a lot to do. Okay, I have a lot to say here. I guess the first thing is, yes, philosophers are in the business of doing objective stories. I believe philosophers are just storytellers of being, which in that sense, they are, if you are addressing being itself, then you are addressing what gives rise to the partial object, where the subjective fiction is focused on the immediate phenomena of the partial object and not necessarily what gives rise to the partial object. So I just wanted to add a little of that to the answer to that question. I think last week's discussion has a lot to do with this, because just to give some context to what makes an objective fiction is when a concept, a phenomena is being addressed at its limit. So when, for example, a manipulator, what is a master manipulator? A master manipulator is someone that you can't even tell that they're manipulating. So if you can't even tell if they're manipulating, is it even manipulation at that point? The whole concept of manipulation gets thrown into question. And then at that point, there's the possibility for an objective fiction to arise because everything is thrown into question. Same thing with like ambition. When you take ambition from like last week's conversation, you situate it at its limit, it's not very clear what ambition is. But the thing is, you need the subjective fiction in order to get to the point where the concept in question is meeting its limit. So I think like Nietzsche, for example, when he says the proposition God is dead, he's trying to take the objective fiction that we're in and situating at its limit in order for a new objective fiction to take form. But the thing is, it takes form in cohesion with the past form, with the past fiction. It's not completely distinct from the past fiction. I would argue there still needs to be a form of you need to still oh my God, I can't say the word. Anthropomorphize. I think I said it right. you still need to anthropomorphize basically the objective fiction, and that to me is the connection between basically having this fiction of God, where there's a certain anthropomorphism. Oh my god, I cannot say that word. For the life of me. Basically, that word is being done to God, and that word is going to be needed for this new fiction. Basically, we need to be able to tell a story that feels so real that we can't even know if it's a deception. Only in the unfolding of the story will we come to terms with it being a deception, and then the possibility of a new objective fiction will emerge. So really, I think it will be ironic to try to consciously think of it as a deception while trying to discover it, because in doing so, you'll just never get there. You'll just constantly be in an ironic situation. So in a certain sense, we need to be so blind and so arrogant. I think there's a certain arrogance, or no, is it ignorance? One of those two words. Basically, we have to be so myopic in a certain sense in creating the story. And just to kind of go with what I was saying last week on the net, it's so communal based. It's like we have to depossess what the fiction is in order for us to gain possession of it. And what I mean by that is I'm like on the net. I'm talking like Daniel and I have different religious backgrounds. You know, like I feel like I just finished watching Samuel Barnes' talk with Cadell. I feel like I can really relate to Barnes, like very much so. Like I feel like I grew up in this like post world where it's like religion's not even like on the, like it's not even on my interface, so to speak. So it's like, how am I able to talk about this meta dimension with Daniel, and yet we come from a completely different history? Like in investigating that, that's where the new story will emerge. In us trying to depossess our historical background in relation to like our history's relation to the religious dimension, depossessing that will allow us to find a new possession. And this new possession won't feel like a fiction. It'll feel like a reality with stakes that have real consequences that I can then have like the possibility of manipulation then should be able to occur. Like not like manipulation in the sense of like a master manipulator, like I'm saying in the beginning, manipulation in the sense of people can sway people based off of this religious dimension. And like that's how much stakes there are. The problem is we live in a world where we're very skeptical about anything that is regarding the religious dimension, precisely because of this ability to persuade. So we need to basically delodge the skepticism first. So that's part of the depossessing, because we're not willing. We don't have the courage to depossess in order to see what happens. So to me, the first part of the process would be to dislodge people, have their guard, their defenses down. And for me, the way to do that is through entertainment. Like I really do think what's going to save the world is the entertainment industry in a very ironic way. Because, and I know I've been talking for a while, I'll pass off. I just have so much to say. Like, thank you for laying the floor out, Javier, with this. But basically, if we can all agree on what is entertaining, it will be the first step in realizing what the objective fiction will be. Because right now we can't agree on what's entertaining. Like back in the day, hundreds and hundreds of years ago, there was a we can agree on what's entertaining as it relates to like an Abrahamic religion. It's like, oh, well, this is a great depiction of, God blah blah blah. Like, and no one will question that because no one wants God's wrath. So so like basically, yeah, it starts there. I have more to say, but I'm curious what Jockin and others have to say. And then, yeah.
Marvelous. I really appreciate that. And perhaps beauty can bear the weight of being a story that if self-deception, we never know it. The apathetic lack, different things. And I appreciate Tyler is in the laboratory trying to figure out what is entertaining to save us. He's actually creating and part of that process. Well done, sir. And it is interesting. Does beauty entertain us or strike us? And is there a way that that strike is entertaining that strike, and entertaining lead you to the place where you can have that strike? And can beauty or the apathetic lack, et cetera, so forth, be precisely the thing that if it is a self-deception, you can never know it's a self-deception? Because it should be noted so there's that idea of, can you tell a story that's so good that you can't tell if it's created or realized? Because if so, that would have the possibility of this holding things together as an objective fiction that may just be objective, because you can never know that it's actually a fiction, quote unquote. It's practically the same because the technical distinction is outside of the realm of confirmability, which, please note, interesting enough, some of the counter-enlightenment thinkers, like, I guess, the guy whose name's Hitchkin, different people, they said that that was one of the keys of, like, God, and why, like, Vico is like, you're going to kill us all by trying to get into the mind of God, because you're trying to understand the mind of God, which once it enters into what we can understand, it will no longer have the possibility of being something to bear. The story of the society to hold us together will be brought into calculation and torn apart. But of course, if you don't bring it into calculation and tear it apart, what if it oppresses people? What if it has you taking out those other religions or those minorities, right? So we brought this thing that was outside the realm of calculation that could bind us together as a story that if it was a self-deception, we couldn't know it was a self-deception, but then it had to stay in the realm of possibly causing oppression. And so what we are in now, so then justice compelled us precisely to tear down givens. And in a way, we're on the other side of that, re-asking the question, okay, how do we regain perhaps the benefits of this thing that was able to hold people together, beauty, God, et cetera, so forth, that if it was a self-deception, you didn't know it was because the story was so good, without creating the exclusions and the injustices and the closed-mindedness and all those various pathologies, right? And the candidate that we've talked about seems to have something to do with lack, because there's also something very funny, right? And then I'll give it to Mr. Jockin. And I think it's a good point as well that, like, there has to be enough similarity for communication. This might be a benefit of language. Like, I can talk about God, like, I can say God, and even an atheist knows what that means, right? Because of the cultural background and the horizon. So, and you were also saying that it's in that limit space. I think this speaks to Mr. Ebert's work. Like, it's in the limit, because but the key is the encounter of the limit is where this new story will arise, right? No, but that would mean you have to overcome your straw manning, your ideological anxieties, your nervousness. You actually have to encounter the other who's willing to be under the gathering of the word God or beauty or philosophy or whatever, to encounter one another, because that's where the surprise occurs and the limit is limitless. So the thing that you're describing where the new story would arise, I do think falls into the realm of the encounterology that we've spoken before. But people aren't going to do that if their ethics makes talking, if the Christian ethics makes it immoral for the Christian to talk with the atheist, or the atheist ethic is like, religion is stupid, I'm not going to interact with them. Everyone creates an ethic that makes encounter immoral, therefore the encounter doesn't occur, or whatever, stupid, a waste of time, and therefore you can't have that encounter occur that could generate the new story. But then this is the interesting thing about the dialogos gathering under beauty, the Platonic dialogue. There's some sort of encounterology there that seems the necessary formulation, as Sandler and people talk about, for the possibility of gathering under beauty.
Sorry, real quick. The hard part to me, you're making me think, is the new story can't say Christianity is wrong, can't say Judaism is wrong. If anything, it boisters it up. It makes it even more real. But it's like, it's only more real as it relates to the new story. So the new story is still the, like, primary reality. But when you do history, it makes sense. It's like, okay, it had to get here through these conflicts, through these differences of, Judaism, Christianity, and so forth. These differences, like the differences are interwoven as a necessity for this new story. That's very interesting, very difficult to like consciously think about and then try to create the new story with that consciously in mind. So like kind of to what like Ebert and like what you talked about, but like Ebert last week was saying, like the reason why he's able to talk so fast is because it basically become implicit. He's thought about it so much that he doesn't need to think about it at all. It's become implicit. So how do we basically take all this explicit information that we're talking about and get it to the point of it being implicit? To me, the only way is to keep talking about it, from what I understand at this point. But
well, to that point, basically what you are describing is the only possibility of global pluralism being a harmony versus a blob that gets us all killed. That would mean the location is in the encounter in limit itself, where people are running into one another, which to me is harmony, global harmony, which has something to do with pointing toward a beauty that basically everyone has to somehow believe that if their religion or if their first principles were the most realized, they would actually all point to some sort of shared beauty that no one has a monopoly of entirely bringing into words. That would, even if Christianity or Islam or Hinduism is more true than the others, all of them would still at the same time acknowledge that the only way to point toward that beauty is in the encounter, and nobody has a monopoly on the quantification of that. So you have an openness but a solidness. And then I think this gets into Net 93 on the freeing of speech. Yes, you need the infrastructure to free speech. You need the net tradition and the actual speaking, because that creates desire, drive, and that actually creates the kind of subjectivity that can do this. But let me get to Mr. Jockin. Everyone take Mr. Jockin's class. Get on it, everyone. Mr. Jockin's class. Mr. Jockin.
Way too kind, Daniel. Where to begin? There's so much. I mean, here, I'll start with the first one. There's a line. So the idea of self-deception with objective fictions. Aquinas has a line about that the soul only knows itself by its images. Right. So you don't even know ourselves without. Basically, this is a discussion of the images, which, by the way, we talk about in my class. So that's a very important part of the topic. It's the nature of images, which operate in a basically intermediate state of actual presence and absence, truth and falsity, all intermixing together. One other thing, I think, Daniel, your note here by capital, I'm reminded from Belonging Game. By the way, everyone buy the book, get part 2. Right, systems versus beliefs. Capital works even if you don't believe it. That's kind of the key. So I think that's also one of the distinction points I'm seeing here about this kind of the objective fiction versus subjective fiction. It depends on the property of belief. Does belief need to be an acquired instrument to make it work, have activity and act upon others or act upon things? Which, by the way, on the idea of the stomping on Jesus, right? Which is an effigy, right? A symbol, right? Then that's the point. And the historical development discussion, there is so again, I'm a Muslim, but I understand the Christian tradition. So one of the important things about it is the revelation of its developments over time. And one of the most important one was the Donatist controversy. There was also the iconoclast one, very relevant to my class, but the Donatist one is actually very important for virtue, because to summarize that point, it was exactly on that issue where priests were being told to basically forsake Jesus, deny publicly your stance, and you would survive. If you didn't, you were crucified. You were basically martyred. The question became, when the persecutions of the Christians were ended, what to do with these priests, especially over the mechanism of the Eucharist. Because it led to the question, does the sanctification of glory from the Eucharist and other sacraments come from the virtue of the individual, or does it come from something else? And one of the developments, the answer was, this is the conclusion of the Donatist argument, it came from something else. That's really important, actually, from a historical point of view, because that started making an association of virtue from individuals. Because basically the problem is, if you have it built in only in individuals, you get into, I forgot which controversy it is. It's not Gnosticism per se, it's like a variation. Basically, by our own works, we can save ourselves. I forgot the name of that school. My mind's blanking. But that's basically what was it was the conclusion of the church tradition about that question. So thus, actually, that's the whole point. So beyond even the public-private distinction that Daniel brought up, it's also just the basic question, where does the virtue power of delivering grace, especially for priests, come from? It came from persona Christi, for example, which is a mode of participation. that leads to a question that your moral goodness was not necessarily by your individual actions, but your submission to God, right? Or by your participation with God directly. That's actually really, so, which is, leads to a very important question. So under this framework, this comes, I have my note here. It would seem that God is not necessarily a belief per se. It's a system. It does not matter if you're believing God or not. It's if the theist, the claim is supposed to be made, this is an acting independent of us. That our participation with God is on us. Because that's generally the stance, is that God needs nothing, but we need him. Right? That's generally the stance. But I'm just meditating on chewing on these points. It's fascinating, just kind of chewing on that idea and point. But it's interesting because obviously the point of what sanctifies and saves individuals, where is our basically our virtue and glory come from, seems to be on its conscious development, seems to show it requires basically a movement of the self, right, in participation with God, through the tradition, as opposed to anything an individual can do. Which would point to a system point of view versus a belief point of view of a given. I just want to point that out. It's an interesting mechanism going on there. Last note, I mean, Daniel, your point about philosophy being a surgeon, I mean, you're instantly quoting me from Phaedrus, Doctor of the Soul, which is of rhetorical dialectic, which is, kind of the question, what does Encounterology work? And surprise, one of his operations is the demonstration of contradiction. Like that was posed, that's one of the mechanisms of it, is to show through one person. I think actually it's kind of interesting. Almost the Socratic method, these dialogues you see from Socrates, you see a kind of radical pluralism occur in Greece. The mythos of the givens of that society were very much in flux. Euthyphro is a great example of that. Even the question of where moral goodness in God comes from, of the divine, which one has priority over the other, was even being put into question, of the pious. The attempt to say, I'm not going to impose onto you a judgment of correct and incorrect or false or true. I'm just going to present a case to you. You give me your definitions, your claims, your first principles, or your premises, and then we're going to work out and see how they succeed or fail. And through the tension that comes up from that, a revelation shows up, opportunity. Now, almost all of them fail. Like once the revelation comes, they all decline it. They basically don't take advantage of the opportunity. But you could see almost a demonstration of what I'm not trying to interpret from that conclusion, but that definitely seems to be kind of speaking through what we're getting at here. Now, I just bring this up because if we generally know that people don't like surprise, they don't like tension, they don't like ambiguity, they don't like sitting in aporia. This is generally one of the marks of one of the acts of like real spiritual strength, is a willingness to endure in that. If we have, I guess what I'm getting at, so Daniel, a big point you brought up many times is the question in a post-globalist society, if we want the average to be able to encounter it better, it would seem to be that historically that's never been the case. So this seems to be a very important, like the degree of signification of the change. I just want to point out how big of a challenge this is. Because what we're basically asking is for people to encounter events like the Socratic method and not dismiss it, shut it down, straw man, right, do all this stuff. That seems like an incredibly difficult demand. And instead, it seems to be the conclusion has been, we're just going to mediate through images. That's basically been the answer. So, and which is ironic. What's really ironic about that? Just to kind of pivot this point. For the longest time, the argument's been made that the arts are useless, right? They're basically this useless thing. But yet in reality, when you actually play this out the way we're talking about it, you realize, oh no, we're actually one of the most important fields because we are the coordinators of coordination. We're coordinated by images, which was a chapter, Daniel, in your first Belonging Again book, Daniel, that had caught my attention with Freud, dreams, and the mob. That was a very powerful chapter. I remember that because that basically made a very clear argumentation in my mind about the use of images for coordination. Fascinating. It's just and the implications of that. So anyways, I think those are my summary notes, but I think I covered all those points. I think also one last note is its relationship of this is from Johannes, right, from the Halcyon Guild. He did have a lecture about Plato and mythologos. So the use of mythos to work with logos. And I think that's actually an interesting argument. That's basically why I'm noting this as a kind of a objective fiction, right? Because it's kind of using the structural reasonings of logos, right? But with the mythos element of it, which I actually see the point of, I can think of it as more like accounts that are beyond us, right? That we do not have confirmation that they are real, but we use them in our argumentation or in our structures for reasoning. Just thinking through these points. One last note, actually, by the way, because actually related to the Donatist controversy was then later on with Thomas More of martyrdom, right? Because the idea is sometimes in these contests of these conflicts, it is in the revelation of one individual who actually affirms the given, which by that points out kind of what we said before, for kind of privational rearticulation of a position, right? Through someone's martyrdom, by someone's witnessing. So these are just points to chew on, but great conversation as usual, everybody.
Outstanding, Thomas Jockin. And yes, this particular historic moment is of great significance and difference in kind, it would seem. But one of the reasons, and then I'll give it to Mr. Rivera, Mr. Murphy, you said, and I very much like that Thomas More on the end, because as you know, Belonging Again 1 ends on this sort of notion of, is this a Thomas More moment? Which means it is actually a question, like the Donatists, like in Silence, of image or beauty. Do you believe, like, where is the virtue located, right? And it's very interesting because on this point, like you're saying, on God and the system and different things, what is the difference between, say, a technological system, an image-based system, and maybe a biological system, or a conversation that is following, or a dance, a systematic dance, or different things? Like, there are these little differences of a human element where, say, in a conversation like this, or the kind of system, this biological system, or more vitalist system, it operates in a way that is like a machine, analogously, but it does so because of human participation. So from on the outside, it might look the same, but actually there's a human variable that is part of it. And the question is, does that change the quality of it? We said once, maybe net 11 on Marion, where we were talking about if you walked into an art gallery and all the paintings were done by an AI, and you didn't know they were done by an AI, or they like, you got to the point where AI could perfectly replicate human beings, you would have to choose that there was a difference between the art that was made by the human in the AI, even if in terms of the images, there wasn't a difference. That would be a kind of absolute choice where you choose to believe there's a difference, that nothing is not lack, that lack is not nothing, even if in terms of the image or the experience, they seem the same, right? So likewise, perhaps there's a way in which you could have a system that's technological and a human-based system or systematic activity that in its result is the same, and yet you choose to see there's a difference anyway, and actually believe that there are some qualities of experience that are possible that are not possible otherwise. And the key, perhaps, basis of that decision would be the possibility of the experience of beauty. That there is some strike of beauty that becomes possible when there is a belief and assent to a human element that is not possible in the same way with the emergent potential that would thus follow when you are interacting in a technological situation that is systematic, because it lacks something more that you are ascribing to. I think also historically, these tensions that you are describing between, basically this may speak to why something like self-deception or gradual learning, like what's the difference between self-deception and gradual learning, or self-images, so that you can, like, is self-deception just a lower rung on the ladder of being after you walk over it? You say, oh, I was self-deceived. Well, yeah, but you also needed to kind of walk up that image, per se, that analogy. You needed to walk up that path to get to the place. It's only self-deception. Well, the funny thing is self-deception is only self-deception if you don't know it's self-deception, right? So what's the difference between self-deception and denial? There seems to be a difference between when you deny a truth because you don't want to face it, and self-deception when you're not facing a truth and you don't know that you're making yourself not face the truth, right? It's almost like self-deception is what must follow from simply finitude, from simply being ignorant. There's going to be degrees of self-deception. The question is, what do you do when you encounter the fact that you are undergoing self-deception, right? Like, then you have the question of denial or not. It's almost like self-deception as a necessary component of finitude or not knowing anything is what leads you to the possibility of choosing to acknowledge the self-deception, which is precisely the moment when it could be sublated, or to engage in denial. And it's almost like I wonder if the self-deception, like we were talking about this image, like givens and releases, this movement of where does virtue located, is there a way in which history has to gradually work through genuinely believing, oh, all we need is givens. Oh, all we need is releases. Oh, all we need is images, precisely so that plausible deniability goes away, that will not work, and that we have to figure out something of a different quality, because otherwise you could continue to just believe that might work, right? And if that is all so, then perhaps there is a way in which this particular moment is where plausible deniability of alternatives is out. We now have to figure out this kind of new quality of interaction of the Socratic dialogue, as you were saying, which if you had not gone through a long process of historical moments and periods, you could deny that this moment was different in quality, because you could say, well, let's go try that. So there almost has to be a gradual loss of plausible deniability, so then you're forced to try the thing that you're talking about. Because otherwise you could just push it off. And I think that association of the doctor of the soul is exactly right. There's a way in which it's like the doctor of the society, the doctor of the collective, like this doctor question of how exactly do you collectively have people more attuned to the more encounterological in the ways we're described? Because then what's interesting about the encounter simultaneously locates virtue in the individual towards something beyond it. Whereas that's the weird move that we're seeming to say there's a double, because like you see in those historic examples, if you say, well, virtue is too located in the individual, well, then maybe it's just arbitrary, and then maybe people don't have a self-defense against oppression if somebody comes in and manipulates them. But then if you say it's outside of them, you may remove the need to condition virtue or to develop or be able to experience those things, because ultimately it's not me, it's God. I'm not, works don't matter, right? There seems to be a ditch on saying your, works do matter, and a ditch on saying they don't matter. But how do you balance that? Well, the encounter seems to be a way, because the work is in the surprise. You work to be able to handle surprise. So you can't claim the surprise in the work, and the surprise points something beyond your finite frame that you can work on. Like that might be pointing at something. But let me give it to Mr. Rivera, Mr. Murphy. Mr. Rivera, I hope you have this on loudspeaker at work. I really do.
Well, it's in my car. Can you hear me? Okay. Yeah, so, I think I briefly disagree with Luber on the ironic situation. Because if we link deception to creation, and this is the thing that I'm still thinking through, to the act of creation, because I think what it is like, if you create a deception just solely by itself, then it would be denial, actually. But Nietzsche is talking about, well, life is like, I have found the groundlessness of the world in my venturing, in my experimenting of life. And so I'm trying to recover, I'm trying to recuperate. But to feel less alone, I had to invent this deception. But this invention of a deception is actually a creation. So, because if you didn't create anything, then you would be in denial. You would deny life. From then on, you would be pessimistic. And this is why Nietzsche calls himself a tragic philosopher and not a pessimistic one. But what I'm trying to think through is this link between deception and creation versus denial, which really looks really similar. Because I would say the only way you can leave the ironic situation is by virtue of creation, like saying, I'm going to create a new mythos for myself. But in the act of creation, I forget, because it's so good, that you leave the ironic situation. And this is, I guess, what it means to be a free spirit in some ways for Nietzsche, because he's trying to get himself out to belong again. But like, to me, it's still really obscure, like what that actually means to give yourself a new mythos. I mean, other than the objective fictions that we have to work with. But I think what we discover really is like we have competing subjective fictions in reality. And it's like what Luber was pointing out, like, oh, I think entertainment will get us out of this. But there's a qualification that Nietzsche gives that I'm still thinking through, which is that in Twilight of the Idols, he says the Apollinian and the Dionysian, they're both modes of ecstasy. But the Apollinian has to do with vision and images, not the Dionysian. It has to do with music. It has to do with emotion, discharging of emotion. But when that's too strong for you, you have to narrow down the world to an image, which is the necessity of the Apollinian. And so this is what's still so interesting is like, I think, and this is what Nietzsche thinks as like art, defines as art, is that if it doesn't give you a form of ecstasy, then it's not art. And I would say, I would probably challenge that most of what we define as aesthetics or art actually doesn't give us any form of ecstasy at all. And are we confusing ecstasy with just avoidance of displeasure? Which is another interesting question to add on to that. I'm not even sure if I could delineate, but I think like ecstasy in the sense of like I go through a complete self-forgetting. But here's the other thing is like, when does self-forgetting become denial, and when does self-forgetting become participation and creation in the act of creating, which to me, I'm still confused as to what that actually looks like. You know, like I'm still lost. Like I'm reading Nietzsche and I'm like, okay, he's saying all these things. Obviously he's not being systematic, but I am fucking confused. But I'll leave it there.
Well, don't worry. By the end of his life, you get the answer. It all works out. So anyway, on the idea of the ecstasy, that's really good. The strike of beauty, there has to be some sort of ecstasy. What's very interesting is art that does not have a strike, then following how we've talked about it, lacks beauty. There's something about beauty that creates ecstasy, but there seems to be a difference between the ecstasy that people normally talk about and the ecstasy that compels you to be virtuous and to experience more of the beautiful and the infinite, right? So what's interesting about that experience of ecstasy, though, is it feels like it's not you, and it compels you to act differently in the world, just like an objective fiction. Like it compels you, even if you're like, I don't believe in beauty. Well, you just felt the strike. It happened. I don't believe in capital. Well, you don't pay your bills. Like there's a kind of bam that occurs. And the issue that it seems like, you know, you're talking about being confused. I think it's because you can't sort it out outside the freaking encounter of a one-to-one particular experience, where then you have to see how these things are different. And the same way that it can be really hard, and then I'll give it to Mr. Murphy, it can be really hard to tell the difference between pizzas and like, what's the difference between this pizza and that pizza? Well, you'd have to eat them because they're made of cheese and tomato and they're like the same, and yet they're not. There's actually differences. But then also, funny enough, like I think about the wine example. Like this is red wine and this is red wine. What's the difference? You could literally not tell the difference between some unless you're like an expert and you've trained and you've developed the palate, and then you can tell the difference, but you would have to what? Drink them. Like literally it's in the experience. And this alignment of the variables of the self-forgetful and the flow and the creation, the deception, it's all in the encounter, which then would mean, yeah, I want pizza and wine, man. That's good. Just do it at work. Just say, why are you drinking pizza and wine? Well, we were talking about freaking like the abysmalness of being and groundlessness and Nietzsche, and we got on pizza and wine. And they'll be like, oh yeah, me too last time I read Zarathustra. So it's like this kind of like, what seems to be discussed is there is a kind of subjectivity that is prepared for an encounter, that live in that encounter can tell the differences between those variables and rightly align them, and be motivated and compelled that way. A kind of surgical activity, doctor of the soul, surgical live, doctor of encounterology. And in the same way, if one could imagine that you go to the gym so that you're ready to lift the heavy weights or to do the hard manual labor when you encounter it, but you had to have gone to the gym to be ready for it, is there something about philosophy arising in this particular historical moment with the realization of groundlessness, just like Nietzsche is describing, that is precisely sociologically a kind of gem that has to spread to the average person on the planet to actually be able to handle these encounterology experiences, or otherwise they descend into nihilism, popularism, strongmen, all of these different pathologies that are occurring. I think there is very good reason, if we take a Hegelian reading where the now emerges to what the moment needs, Sociology starts in the 19th century with global pluralism, the encounter of true, deep, ontological otherness, where it's clear that there is ontological variation, not simply in abstract thought, but your neighbor is now a Hindu and you're interacting and it turns out they're a good person. Wow, plausible deniability is gone. You're encountering them. Man, your beliefs could actually not be true or incomplete. And if they're not, you couldn't even know it. Anxiety, anxiety, anxiety. There's a certain then kind of subject training that is necessary to handle that. And this is where I think the emergence of sociology needs to be tied together with a character of philosophy. It is a philosophical practice as a soft science that is actually a kind of returning to something that we see classically on aligning with the beautiful, because it's very interesting, like, which then seemingly in the classical mind, this is, you're talking about this idea of finding something that has a kind of authority. This kind of finding of an objective fiction, like this telling a story that then you achieve this thing, you're like, well, this has to somehow be true, even if I don't know how, even if I somehow approached it. You see lots of classical philosophers doing something like that. We'll just use the beauty example. It's like, surely, yeah, we know we came up with this conversation. We know we just kind of created the context of this conversation. We know it's created, but in the midst of the creation of this social setting, we suddenly realize something that is not arbitrary, even if this particular gathering and conversation and topic, we didn't know where it was going to go. There's a way in which every Platonic dialogue is a kind of created social setting, right? Or even the net. This is a created social setting. We all know we created this conversation and could have just as easily talked about frickin' hot dogs. So there's not that, we can't talk about hot dogs. I see that look in your eyes. That there's a particular arbitrariness to this social configuration. But what happens when you have a good conversation? There's a moment when you say, wow, this isn't merely arbitrary. There's something more going on. There's some contours of something, however incomplete, that is being traced out. That sort of activity seems to be what the average subjectivity on the planet has to have as an experience to give them enough social rootedness and groundedness to not fall into all of the pathologies of the modern world, right? The closest thing I can think about it is math. What happens with mathematics? It has to be discovered. They're like, it works too well. So mathematics, it's almost like what Luber said. We have to get so good at telling stories in a way, or engaging in social practices, that we have the experience like analogous to the mathematician that one day says, there's no way this is created. It has to be discovered. And even if we all say that's impossible, and it kind of has to be, right? We don't know. There's uncertainty. That's enough for a sociological paradigm. Mathematics is a model of, if you could bring that into the realm of the humanities and conversation and philosophy, that is a model of an ambiguity of not knowing if it's created or discovered. And it seems like both, that if you could make as a basis for a sociological paradigm, then it actually would make possible overcoming this groundlessness of being that actually turns out to be an openness to the possibility of creations that reach a point where you can't tell if they're realized or not. And then that seems to blur together the systematic and the negotiation. Because is math systematic? Yeah. But is it arbitrary? It's systematic, and yet you feel like it's created, so it doesn't have power over you, but surely it's not created because it was discovered. Bam. So there's a certain activity there, a certain ambiguity that creates authority, but not oppression in the same way. So that's a model. But then, of course, maybe the problem is precisely the effectiveness of mathematics in bringing forth this kind of odd ontological ambiguity contributed to the reductionism and algebraicness and the loss of situation in the human, because we're like, well, we can find it in the mathematical, dang it. Well, humans aren't freaking points, right? So what would be a more geometrical or situational version of that same sort of schema that is not reductionistic in the same way? It seems to have something to do with storytelling and art, because we all know that moment, if you've ever created, and I'll give it to Tyler here, that moment when you're creating something or a good story or a paper and suddenly it doesn't feel like it's yours anymore. Where did this come from? I never had this idea. You're writing a story and the characters get a life of them. The painting arises to you. And if I would ask you, was that painting created or realized? Was that story created or realized? Was that paper created or realized? You can't answer. And so I think the phenomenology of the artist can be a helpful point by which to think about these sociological problems. But let me give it to Mr. Murphy. Mr. Murphy, good to see you today. I hope you're doing well.
Good to see you guys. Yeah, I like this idea of trying to become doctors of Encounterology. And I was writing down how, we need gyms for that. And the net is one of those gyms. And this is just what I've been thinking about a lot is, what is, like, how do you collectivize, what role does belief have in the collectivization of people? And how do we create collectives where, people belong? And of course, they're going to probably share in some set of beliefs, whether those are explicitly stated or implicitly, kind of underlying, say, a group like this. There's a whole bunch of implicit beliefs, I think, operating with all of us just as we participate in the net. Don't be super rude to somebody. Don't just like jump in whenever, all these kind of unspoken rules. But how do you collectivize and have belief that I guess would be held in your hand openly and not closed off like a fist and used to just create another form of tribalism where we become obsessed with the confession of whatever that belief is. And it's all about just my mental ascension to whatever the collective says this is what's true and right and good. And so, I think somehow it will, like, how do we create the new story, the new fiction that we all get behind? I think it's not something that we can consciously bring into our reality, but we can lay the foundation for surprising speech events to break forth, which is what these kinds of spaces are all about. You don't know if it's going to happen at a net conversation or a story night, or even when you're in session in a psychoanalytic session. You go there, 2 or 3 times a week and are talking to the analyst, and probably 9 times out of 10, nothing remarkable really happens. But then on that 10th time, you find yourself saying something that was in you that you didn't even know was in you. You overhear yourself, you overhear the unconscious, or you have this moment of wit in a conversation that, breaks apart whatever the given status quo is in some sense. So anyways, these are all things that are just percolating for me. And also, this another way that we can maybe talk about these kinds of gyms, these kinds of spaces, would be through like what Ivan Illich is talking about as convivial spaces versus manipulative spaces, and places where people are choosing to come to rather than feeling obligated and forced into joining and affirming whatever the ruling belief system is. So anyways, those are just some of my thoughts.
Magnificent. Absolutely magnificent. And I always love a good Ivan Illich reference. Oh my freaking gosh. Illich is actually central to all this, because we have to see him, like, a key notion of Illich is basically, like, when they asked him, and Dave actually brought this up, and Ivan Illich, a way to sum it up from, like, we talked about parallax, is Ivan Illich is like all of the institutions, all of the systems, everything basically favors a kind of disablement. And the human is formulated to plan, not to prepare. And this is why when Illich was asked, well, what's the alternative? He's like, to hope more. Because let's put it this way. If the problem is technological thinking or technique or planning and all of that, then how do you offer an alternative to that without engaging in technological planning thinking, right? Huh? How do you do that? Because if you create, yes, holding the hand, but then to keep your hand open, you have to be prepared for whatever you encounter to keep it open. So Ivan Illich is pointing toward, ultimately, in my opinion, a political economy, education system, medical system, everything that is all about clearings, faith, to use Heideggerian language, faithful presence, and a work in that clearing, a really hard work for something you don't know if you're ever going to need one day or if it's ever going to amount to anything, right? That is the only way to offer a hyperhumanist world versus a transhumanist world, to use Mr. Caden Smith's language, Hagen Smith. Because if the name of the game is to be really, really good at planning or calculation or quantification, AI wins. And the system wins in the logic of capital Nick Land, right? Well, that means the only mode of being that would be alternative to that is preparing versus planning. Now, I'm not trying to demonize technology, because technology could absolutely be in service of this. You know, Illich was big, where he's like, look, I'm not as pessimistic as Eunoia, who wrote The Technological Society. I actually see some hope here for conviviality. He actually gets into some really interesting stuff on the history of contingency and how that's a part of it. But anyway, the notion is the subject, all of society needs to be about training subjects of preparation versus planning, which of course is the subject of encounterology. And also the subject of preparing means you believe that you should do something versus believe premises. Like, this is the problem. Belief now means I have certain views of what is true versus I believe in myself to do a thing. I believe in preparing. Belief in encounterology, that I'm just going to keep using that phrase because, you know, encounterology, you know, we got to add I can't even say it. I can't even freaking say it. Like anthropomorphize the other day. You were talking about that, Luber. I always say anterolorthize, like a deer, basically antlers. So don't worry about it. Anyway, there is this kind of idea of belief in encounterology would be belief in yourself to handle or belief to do without guarantee, right? Like, this is belief. Well, what is anyone who tries to be an artist or do this crazy philosophy work? People are like, why are you doing it? I don't know. And yet I have a sense that it's important, but I can't tell you the plan or anything, but I know it's some sort of preparation for something. So the phenomenology of the artist, the way the artist lives, functions as the psychotechnology to formulate yourself according to a belief in encounterology that would make you able to offer a subjectivity that is not capturable in by the systems of control, and that is operating according to preparation, not planning, which is the alternative that Ivan Illich is saying is necessary for the human to be human, to not be lost into the logic of capital, right? But this is the other trick to it. Basically, like you were saying, Jim's at the net, and then I'll give it to Luber, Clayton, and then Chetan. If Cole Planier is correct that capital market societies have to be made, if Dr. Smith is correct that human subjectivity is formulated by cultural liturgies or environments, not information, which basically, if we go through the history of aesthetics and sociology, to make a very broad claim, they all argue that human subjectivity is not a result of me saying, Tyler, you ought to be good at like frickin' encounterology. No, information doesn't really change people. That doesn't mean it's irrelevant. What changes people is environments that work on your subconscious associations that formulate you. The key term that Smith says is humans are a result of formulation, not information. If that's the case, then you need to create aesthetics, experiences, gems in society by which people can have experience to say, wow, I need to be able to handle encounter. But here's the key. If Carl Planier in The Great Transformation, for example, is correct, that culture as distinct from markets, are basically never random. They are not let's put it this way. Culture is not a product of rationality. It is a product of creativity and intuition. But culture is what creates formulation. And the way that we become subjects of preparation versus planning, ergo avoid capture, Nick Land, and all of that, is therefore a matter of the cultural, then it is a matter of the practices that you were told in school aren't going to get you a future. Basically, what we are arguing is that all that stuff that told you you're not going to make a future is precisely that's necessary to save the human future. So we made a mistake. Let me pass it to Mr. Luber and Clayton. Mr. Luber, please.
So a couple things. Like with regard to what Tyler was saying, because what Tyler was saying, I want to package it in responding to what Javier is saying. God damn it, Javier, you left. I don't disagree with what Javier was saying. So like with the open hand, closed hand. So with deception, you need to believe. So like the parameters of the net, for example, it's like pretty open-handed, it appears. But if you really think about it, it's actually very closed-handed, you know? Like you can come on the net and talk about anything. Well, I'm not going to come on the net and talk about like, yeah, my dog needs his anal gland squeezed. Like, no one cares about that. Like, you might bring it up as a joke, like, but like if I were to have an entire 10-minute, everyone has their like 5 to 15-minute, wait, why not? I mean, I don't even know if I could think of 15 minutes of things to say about my dog's anal gland. Thank God it hasn't happened yet, but he's a scooter, so you know what that means. It's the point that I'm trying to make is you are under a structure. You're undertaking a structure so much so that you see it as open when it is closed. Like, it needs to be closed, and you being so in the closed fist that you don't even see it as closed anymore. So, like, for like Nazis, for example, they were closed and closed. They weren't closed and open. There was no deception. And like, that might be part of the lore. That might be actually part of the attraction, which is that there was no deception. They were so, in a certain sense, transparent in terms of what they wanted to do. But that just won't work. Like, otherwise it wouldn't work. So, like, America is a perfect example of self-forgetting, of this deception, where we believe we are so, like, at least like the traditional look, it's like freedom of speech, we're so open, blah blah blah, that we forget how much we're not. Like, there is this deception occurring here that makes it work. Otherwise we wouldn't be such an influence around the world. I'm not saying it's a good or bad influence, but nonetheless, there is a certain attraction that people are on the same wavelength. They have to be. They have to address the United States. Like, if there is some form of global economic move, you can't do it without the United States in mind. I mean, that is because there's a deception. I would say all the great superpowers have this deception displaying. So in my mind, it's not that. What my point is that you can't go into implementing a structure with deception in mind. That you need to go into the structure being you're depossessed, and then you discover a way to be possessed, and in that initial possession, you forget everything at that point. And that's like when you're writing a story, like for me, a lot of the beginning, like a lot of writing the script is being depossessed by the story. So when you start going through beat by beat and you're getting each moment and you're really visualizing it, you start to become possessed. So what a good script does, it's the blueprint for possession to possibly occur. And like when a script isn't good, you can't visualize it. It's that concrete. It's that simple. Like, you can't see different possible ways of executing a beat. Like, the beauty of a good script is you show 5 directors it, they'll have 5 different ways of going about it. That's the cool thing about a script. So I think so the whole point of deception is that you just need to believe it so much that it's not a belief anymore. And the second it's not a belief anymore, that's when you are deceived. And like, that's a good form of deception. I forget which net, but I think it might have been that net 11, where it's like, the humans need to be self-deceiving. We need to trick ourselves. Otherwise, we will cease to be human. We will become robots. Like, it's really key. So like, I want to transition this into like what this new story is, because I have a lot of thoughts. I've been wanting actually to write you an email, Daniel, about like themology and just like the beauty of storytelling as like a concept for and like my next philosophical book project. But basically, 'cause I feel like I'm there where I can like write another like 50 to 100 page something. So just taking so many notes. Basically, a sequel, and we've talked about this. We've talked about the concept of a sequel because basically what needs to happen is a sequel. Basically, when you get to the point of logos, mythos, pathos, and you meet the limit of each, you realize how they all need each other. And in that sense, that to me, the limit of each and seeing the need for that, like the need of how they need each other at the limit, is theme. So like there's a certain mythos to theme that is beyond your understanding of the theme. And that's where the mythos is. There's a certain pain, there's a certain sadness when you're undertaking a theme because it hurts in a certain sense, because there's just so many possibilities that could be implemented, and figuring out which one to go about is painful. It sucks. Like anybody that writes, it's typically not fun. There's just the fun part is in the catharsis in when you get it out. That's when it becomes fun. And then there's a logos to it all the while. Like you need the pathos in order to have the logos, and you need the mythos as well in order to have the logos. So basically the sequel needs to recognize all three. It needs to recognize how there is a certain pain in finding the sequel, in the transition. There is a finding, there is a certain discovering, so something beyond you that dictates you. That's the mythos dimension in my mind, where there is some form of flow that you tap into, that you create something that's good. And basically when that happens, the goodness, like when goodness is at play, truth is then situated both at the object, the full object, and the partial object. So it's in both camps in my mind. So basically there's a certain truth that you're attracted to, that you have a certain sensation about, and then there's a certain language, there's a certain there's a certain way of it unfolding, that it comes out of you, that's the logo. So I'm trying to put my thought. So everything, my point basically is that we have to realize how the old story was operating, and then essentially the new story will have to be an inversion, a complete inversion of how that old story was operating. So if you think of it in terms of like computation, God is this abstract computation that provides all computation. Now what's happening with AI is a non-abstract computation that will provide all computation. So there is an inversion of God at play with AI, where it will provide all possible ways of knowing, but not in the abstract form. So the inversion is in the medium, abstract, concrete. And then eventually that will run its course, and then there will be another inversion that needs to be played out. And that we will never know, but it's going to have to do with the through line of the limit between logos, pathos, and mythos. And that's where, if you stay focused on the limit of all three, you'll just realize how the medium is just inverting. It's just an inversion of the past medium. And like, it's not that hard when you think of it like that. It's like freakishly simple. The hard part is like believing it, undertaking it, and letting it play out, and convincing others to do the same. But I do think part of me is you don't really need to convince others per se, because deception's already at play. Like, you don't ever leave the ironic situation. You just forget that you were in it. And then you remember that you're in a new one. That's the whole point of like a story. So I think, and just to cap it off, we are already undertaking a new story. We just haven't realized it yet. And I think the name of the game is in realizing the new story. And it's not necessarily creating a new story. It's just discovering that we were already in one, like this new story. And that, again, once that discovery happens, no one's going to be like, oh, Christianity is wrong, or Judaism is wrong, or these ancient, anything is wrong. Everything's going to be resituated into a perennial yes, a perennial, this is all part of what led me here. So it has to be the case that there is some truth to it because it led me here. And with Jockin's beauty, that's what beauty does. Beauty will reorient the history and make you realize that there was no falsehoods. And like, that's a very dangerous thing to say to people that can't get there, because they could get triggered. Like, if I say that to a lot of Jewish people, there were no falsehoods, like, and that's like, what the fuck is wrong with you? Like, your ancestors were killed. And it's like, wrong approach. It's an approach where you're not letting yourself be deceived, which ironically makes you the most deceptive. Because you can't actually keep going at that point. You're in a static state again. But anyway, I'll pass it off.
No, magnificent. I'll give it to Clayton Cheetah. There is a point where denying the possibility of deception is denying your own finitude and inability to know everything and to be at the end of time. And so if you deny it too much, you're basically saying that we've got it. But of course, that is the decline. Therefore, the denial of deception is kind of an ultimate deception, because you're kind of saying you're God or something at that point, right? Yeah, and this notion of the simple, yeah, Jesus loves you. That's simple, and you get an entire worldview from it. A lot of the religions are based on these incredibly simple points that actually, when you unpack it, there's a lot there. Likewise, I say that cup is worth $10. That's simple, but everything that is required for it to be meaningful for me to say to you that cup is worth $10 required thousands upon thousands of years of generating markets, abstract social form, labor, cup as a concept. Like, saying a very simple thing entails this very wide horizon. And so likewise, like you say, it's simple. It's just an inversion. Like, there's a simplicity to it, but the very ability to say it's simple actually requires centuries of backlog of ideas and thought that make it simple. And it's simple in the sense you can apprehend it. The funny thing is, so many of the sociologists teach that the things we apprehend as simple and practical, that cup is worth $10, is a miracle. It required centuries upon centuries of making markets, making abstract social labor. So now you're at the point where you could just apprehend that cup is worth $10, and it not even occur to you that it's remarkably wild that we can say that cup is worth $10. And this is where the historic movement seems so necessary. I think basically the realization that is collectively occurring is that it's something apathetic, something annihilative, something negative, something that's kind of empty at the bottom. That is what is collectively being realized. And every single religion, every single philosophy, every single worldview belief, and everyone is kind of calibrating and working and orbiting around a more apophatic structure. That is it apophatic because we're finite and it's actually an excess that we're encountering? Is it a nothingness because it's like a void at the beginning? Is it apophatic because you can't have givens? And like all philosophy, like more and more, the meaning crisis, if you will, is precisely evidence that the sociological condition of the average person on planet Earth is a realization of a kind of groundlessness to being, right? Not just philosophers, the average person on the planet is starting to realize that more and more, right? The creativity is the question of, what does that mean? Does that mean that life is meaningless and why try? Does that mean that God is apathetic? Does that mean we need the apathetic walking stick, as Clayton talks about? What does it mean? But there is this realization of something that is inseparable from the creative act. And then the question is, what are the structures that help us best engage with that? You mentioned the open hand. What's very important with the open hand, so we'll talk about the closed hand, the drop hand, but the open hand, the structure is the hand. You have to have a structure in that a sense is closed. Otherwise, you couldn't hold a thing with an open hand, right? So you have to have something in a sense that functions like the closed, but, you know, there's a difference, right? Like the issue is, for most of history, it was either this or the bad nihilism is that, right? The apathy, what's increasingly a realization, and then I'll give it to Clayton here, is the notion that subjectivity, societies, economies, et cetera, somehow have to figure out what it means to formulate themselves like this with an open structure versus not. And the difference is seeing how the beauty disappears from the situation. I think with an open hand, you have to be ready for the bird to leave. You have to be ready for the bird to come and go, which means it's hard and terrifying, but you're prepared for the beauty to go because you've done the work to believe it will come back and to act as if it will. And you said something very important. You said this idea that you work really, really hard to get to the place where something possesses you. There's a kind of possession that occurs. The questions we have to ask, what are the difference between deception and design? Like you design something to get to the place where something possesses you, but is that different from a deception where you know the truth and denying it? This is what's very odd. The human subjectivity seems to require fictions that they design that are objective fictions, but they're not the same as deceitful, immoral lies to manipulate, that by doing creates the condition of the possibility of the possession that is the open hand. So you enter a self-forgetfulness that is encountering with the beauty. And that is the sociological condition that has to spread for people to handle this moment. But let me give it to Clayton. Clayton, please. It is good to see you, my dear friend. I hope you are doing well.
Yeah, I'm doing all right. It's a bit cold here. And you guys are saying everything that I agree with. So it's really beautiful. Something I just wanted to add to that is nothing different from what you're all saying. It's just very much in the same spirit. Especially like what Luber was talking about there, like, you know, that retrospective look of, you know, when it's kind of like when you start to explode the theme and see the theme within the theme, you see how all true it is. And like I like to say that in existence, like one of the currencies or the fuel of existence is truth. It's kind of like whatever managed to exist had a certain wisdom, which kind of like was the anchor of its truth. And so it's like, it's true. Even the deceptions we're talking about, they are true. And so like one thing I was, you know, ruminating upon sometime this week was this sense of, I think one place where we get stuck as, you know, autopoetic creatures is we have this sensibility for, and I think we spoke about this with Guy, like the sensibility for what is right. And that is like the burden that we are struggling with, because you know, there's moral truth that is kind of like helping us to stay within like some logical framework, right? And be in sync with that. But there is also that situational truth, which may, in most cases, like you know, was saying before, like may be in conflict sometimes with moral truth. And so you know both of them to be right, and then you're in between, and you're now like, but we like to know, right? And we want to narrow it down to just the one. It's like, and we've been, even in this net session, there's been I was like, is it this or that? Is it this or that? And sometimes it's actually in most cases, it's not this or that. It's both. It's like, yes, it's all of them at the same time. It's like, yeah, it's morally true. It's realistically true in this sense, and that is outside the realm of what the moral framework can hold. but that doesn't make it false, because in our sense of what, in our sensitivity to what is right, we know it to be okay. And so now we're caught in between. It's like, yeah, it's like, it is true and it is right, but we can't find a logical articulation for it so that we can put it in the moral framework and kind of like have it as something simple that we can always touch and reference. And so we're caught in between. And that's why kind of like you'd enjoy children, because they challenge that boundary all the time. They're kind of like, you said this, but then you did that. Are they both true? And then they throw you in that ironic situation, you know, and then you can't even find the language, right? And so it's been a beautiful net session. I've really enjoyed it. And we should talk about hot dogs, but I'll pass it.
You are a beautiful soul, Clayton, and that conversation with Guy was fantastic. I'll give it to Chetan and Andrew. What you were saying on this balance and more, it just makes me think, again, like Luber was also noting on this kind of limit navigation space between the logos, mythos, and pathos. I think about how you find yourself between that when you like write a story or do art all the time. Is my story going to have a sex scene or not? Well, it would be realistic to have a sex scene, but that's kind of immoral because maybe I'm objectifying women. Or you're like, well, I need more pathos. I need more emotion in the story. There's too much logos, too much logic. There's a lot of ideas, but the philosophy is like overriding the characters and their conversation and different things. Well, now it's just emotion and there's no logos, so who cares, right? The artist in the creative act is constantly trying to make constant decisions, somehow navigating or working between those three things, and whatever decisions you arrive at, your audience might be like, that sucks. And then, of course, how do you do it? Like you're in this state of this perpetual decision, and then the artist also knows, just like we talked about in objective fiction, a story is not anything goes. There has to be a logic. There's a way that it works, and yet at the same time, it kind of is anything goes, but it's not because it's a theme, and that is getting at the subject, the person who is habituated and familiar with that kind of situation and that kind of decision making and that kind of operation seems to be the kind of subject that is needed today in the world to avoid global pluralism eating itself and stuff, which would be sad. But so I was thinking about that, but let me give it to Mr. Chetan and Mr. Luber. Chetan, it's so good to see you. I hope you're doing well today, sir. It's always a pleasure.
I've been off the grid for a while. I was sort of living in forest for like 15, 20 days. It's extremely interesting discussion. And I'm sort of wondering where to sort of get my own thoughts on this from. I think one of the things we sort of overlook when we discuss this question of storytelling, and something we need to start thinking, that for a long time, stories were the way through which human could affirm reality. You know, and when today also we realize that if we get too deep into questions of nature and reality, eventually what we get are narratives. Science and mythology is a way to affirm that fact. You know, mythology is going to the end of that problem. And today also, when we discuss positivism, we discuss science, and science's ability to bring us out of these out of the story in that sense. We do realize that science's urge to come out of stories, in fact, recreate certain fictions. Science is not outside that in that sense. And we can then ask, what is science really done over there? Lacan has a very interesting, provocative sort of ways to think about Descartes' Cartesian cut over there, and we can sort of start reflections from there. But what I am sort of posing it as a problem is that sort of interests me from this discussion is that within this frame, one thing should become, I think, somewhere evident to us, that whenever human being would want to grasp, in some senses, some kind of a texture of reality for himself or herself, at least us ordinary beings who are not scientists, who are not quantum physicists and whatever, we would fall back upon stories. Eventually, as human beings, as a language teacher, when young children learn language, they always fall back upon stories. You can't learn, You can't make sense of the world without the certain kind of this entry into this other world. And given this problem in that sense, and so maybe I can add another dimension to this question of fiction in that sense from, say, Lacan's mirror stage. And Lacan sort of ideates that human bodies are fragmented without the support of images from the outside, which is what I think makes this ground for storytelling to be so powerful technique in that sense. And is it where the question of deception come into play? That deception in that sense isn't simply something that makes us distant from reality in that sense. In fact, deception is a condition for human beings to have access to reality. Because you have to sort of, in some senses, borrow the images from your surroundings, such that now you can have this notion of complete body from which you can have motor activities, hand movements, I can control my fingers and so on and so forth. The child can't do that because his body is fragmented. So in some senses, storytelling is at the heart of this link between fragmented body and the borrowing of the images. This cannot happen without in some senses support of the story in that sense, some narratives that child starts encountering with. And maybe we can start thinking about this question, which Lacan sort of thought about this link between fragmented body and the image through the mirror. What role stories play in creating these mirrors for us? That's one way to frame that kind of a question. And stories definitely play a critical role in thinking about those mirrors. And then that's one, I think, sort of the other sort of maybe a question about what you've been sort of raising, this question of belief and this technical thinking, the creation of technical objects. What are they doing? And that comes back to this question of science in some senses. One of the ways I've been thinking about that problem, and it's not a foolproof way to think about it. And I've been asking, what is the problem with, in some senses, this calculative mind, this planning, and my own sort of answer, and Daniel, you know it very well, we've been discussing it for a long time, this question of entropy, and we go back to this problem of this rapid increase of entropy where we are engaging with predetermined ends. Why does it happen? What makes that structures that problem in that way? We can ask those questions. And I'm simply talking about entropy as this complete reduction of useful energy. There's something about this question that we have more useful energy when we are more embedded in stories. If I may put it like that, we have more energy to work. And once we sort of falling short of stories, somewhere we experience a rapid rise of entropy in our lives and in our being, which we can't sort of get around in some senses. And that is where this sort of a problem starts to build for us in that sense. And we can sort of start going back to that problem of thinking of reality not from the side of the object but on the side of the subject. And technology in that sense becomes this pharmacological question where it can either sort of give rise to the rapid rise in entropy, or it can sort of become this tool which supports anchoring of the human subject in different symbolic realms in that sense. Now, given this, and I just want to maybe make a last point on this question of objective fictions versus subjective fictions. It's a very interesting discussion and this distinction, and it sort of made me sort of go into my own world for a few minutes or so of maybe thinking around this problem. And you're absolutely right. If we think about this question, there are certain fictions which function without us believing in them. And Santa Claus is sort of example of Zizek, or a very powerful sort of joke of Zizek, which sort of the horseshoe, the Niels Bohr saying that the horseshoe functions whether they believe in it or not, and that is where also this idea of scientific mind comes into picture, who doesn't believe in the beliefs. Interesting thing is that certain beliefs can function without us believing them. That tells you the nature of automaticity that exists. And it is the same entropic question that comes back. That certain beliefs can be made automatic to the point such that you don't need to believe also. And that is what we are calling the objective fiction in some senses. If we sort of probe this problem further, this problem of sort of rapid increase of entropy is a problem of human decision. Because once you eliminate the capacity for human decision from the picture, you make circuits shorter and shorter. And it's extremely interesting that the faster the human judgments about things are, the more easy it becomes to automatize the system. The more easy it becomes to eliminate the judgment itself. So in some sense, suspension of judgment itself becomes a condition for the judgment to exist. There's a long circuits as that drives, which Freud would talk about, Lacan would talk about. There's a longer sort of path becomes possible only when human decision is included through its own suspension in some senses. So only when we suspend our capacity to make decisions, make them in the longer run, that the human subject sort of re-emerges in this problem. And belief is again an interesting question, because simply believing in things is not the answer to the problem in that sense, because simply believing would again make other automatic circuits. The challenge is that how do we retain the capacity for belief such that human decision, the human subject still remains an active participant in the creation of subject, these circuits. And belief remains an important category, not as something through which we can defend or weaponize against this automaticity, but the very fact of its presence. When we use it, it actually reduces and vanishes. It's only when we start actively believing, we again become this automatic. But the very fact we can believe, that potentiality of belief is extremely important for these circuits to be elongated. And how do we remain open to these potentialities remains a challenge for us. And I think that's where storytelling has a very important and critical role to play for us. I'm not sure how to, maybe you guys can maybe talk more about it. Yeah.
Absolutely outstanding. That possibility of belief. If people have the possibility of belief, what might they believe? What if they go astray? What if they believe something terrible, right? So there's a fear, so let's cut it off. But if you remove that possibility of belief, there's no participating in the images. And so even if the images are there, they become automatic, or there's no images at all and we just fall back into logos. So there has to be this active component. But if there is an active human contingency, then who knows what might come out of there? Could it be beauty or could it be Lovecraft? That's where at the possibility of belief is a kind of opening that can come out of human subjectivity. And what it's a Lovecraft monster? Well, what if it's a beatific vision? If you remove that risk, it's done. Entropy sets in. But we have to be the kind of subjects that can handle that risk. So you said, look, everything you just said, I think, is absolutely shown by history. There is historic evidence of this. I'm just going to use Carl Planier's Great Transformation as an example. So he makes a distinction between a market society and a market economy. Now, I don't always hold to that language, but the argument is the following. A market economy doesn't work without a market society. The argument of many Austrians is that a market economy naturally creates a market society. It just follows, right? Planier is like, no, it doesn't. The governments, the states, the artists, the aesthetics have to create a story that makes the market society, so it creates the kind of subjectivity that makes the market economy work. So you have to have the rationality, the logos, and the mythos align. If they do not align, then it doesn't work. You get all sorts of problems. Likewise, let's go to Matthew's book on Japan. Like, if you want to have a nation, Japan, and it not fragment into a bunch of people that can rebel against power and, revolutions and different things, then you have to have a Japanese society and a Japanese nation, or a Japanese citizenship, like a Japanese identity and a Japanese government. If there's no Japanese identity, then people rebel against the government. But if you have a Japanese identity, but no government, it's anarchy and no one can relate. So you have to have the image and the logos go together, or else it doesn't function. What has happened is we basically, today you could say, have logos, rationality, but no image. no mythos, right? Well, then it's entropy. Like that's what happened with capital and markets. Like we moved away from story because it's scary and it created religious wars and all these different things, which then goes in a logos direction that then creates entropy. So the argument of hopefully belonging in one is that you must have capitalism tends toward the loss of demand. We've talked about creating demand and stimulating demand. The reason capitalism starts off with an explosion of creativity, mythos, and like the Dutch Empire, Dietrich McCloskey, an explosion of this creating of story, like people actively creating and wealth creation and different things. But then it tends to move away from that into stimulating demand, not creating demand, but then it has the great stagnation, entropy. That is the movement of capitalism, because capitalism tends to move away from acknowledging or participating in the image. It tends to become pure logos, pure no image. Image is gone. Well, then there's no human contingency. There's no human element. Once the human element is gone, once the imagery is gone, once the mythos is gone, human motivation collapses. People are simply not motivated. And it turns out logos alone cannot create wealth or economic activity without human motivation, unless you replace it with AI, unless you replace it with technology. So rather than return to image or figure out how to have that human element involved, we've just decided to go more so in the machine direction. And that's what Nick Land talks about, right? That the logic of capital is logos without mythos, right? But that is not going to bring back human motivation, but you have to bring in images. But then the critical thing that everyone would say, they'd say, well, Daniel, look back in history. The religious myths, that oppressed people. That's what the religions did. They had imagery. They had myth, but they didn't have logos, so that was oppressive. So what do we need then? You can't have pure image. You can't have pure rationality or technical thinking. You have to have some creating image, creating story, like a hyphen between them, where you are always, as human subjects, creating mythos or creating imagery. It's the phenomenology of the artist, the creative act, active, not on a final product, where you are actively part of it. You are creating the storyteller with the hype. Yeah, that's right, Mr. Luber, and I'll give it to you. But that kind of subjectivity that is actively creating and participating in the image, never settling on an image, it is always creating with it, would require that opening of belief. Belief to stay open to that, to stay active, to stay in that place. And that's scary, because who knows what may come out of that? Who knows what may occur? But if you do not do this, you are going to fall into image. You're going to fall into entropy. You're going to lose demand. You're going to lose, even if you have a national identity, everybody hates it because you were talking earlier about national identity of Luber, national identity, hegemony, and all these things. That's soft power. American soft power bringing the world together, right? More and more people see the soft power, and so it doesn't work. It feels like oppression. When everyone was part of the soft power and felt like the soft power was on their side because it wasn't just an American empire controlling everyone, then it felt like a good thing. But now it feels like a deception. But here's the problem. If you don't have soft power at all, then it just splinters off. So you need something like soft power, something like deception. But how do you then have a deception that people doesn't feel like is a hegemonic empire controlling them, right? Well, they have to feel like they're part of it and that they're creating part of it. Could AI help with this? Could it not? Basically, the overall, and I'll give it to Luber here. The main argument that I think history shows, if we go through Planier and all of these aesthetics of sociology, we think that the world is made by rationality. The world is made in the image and likeness of its image and likeness. That's what the world is made by, because that creates the mythos that then formulates people, that logos formulates according to, but then it's almost sometimes in the interest of the capital nation state to make us think rationality is what humans need to create wealth, because then we're not creating our aesthetics, so the state does and controls us by formulation and soft power. But the image and like the history of nations, societies, is a history of formulation, that rationality can free us from formulation that oppresses us. But then if we go too far into the direction of rationality and formulation without returning to image, we get entropy. But how do we return to it and not just fall back into the previous things? Creative, the storyteller with the hyphen. But let me give it to Mr. Luber and then.
I want to keep what I have a lot to say, but I want to keep it short because I'd rather Chetan talk than me. basically, well, one for Chetan, that's sick that you went to the forest. Like, that's so fucking cool. It
Oh my
really
gosh,
is.
it's like the dream. That's like the straight dream.
It really is. Like, I envy you so much. Like, oh, I was away. I was in the forest. Wow, that's so cool. Um. Okay. So. Okay. AI has to be that which gives us the news story. It literally it's either going to be that or it's going to destroy us. It like I think Daniel, your course presents like the case for the parallax course, like undeniably. Um, it's going to give us a new mythos with the logos and the pathos all at once. It's not going to be, heavy focus in one direction or the other, like history has shown. Like we're in a heavy logos right now. I think what happens, and it happens when I tell stories. It's I'm working with other people. I'm working with AI. I'm like when you get in a really deep conversation on ChatGPT, you kind of forget how you even got to the place of where you are in the conversation with ChatGPT. So in a dialogos, you will forget. It's just you will forget. You're human. That's part of it. So I think the design versus deception. So for example, like Chetan was saying, like the object versus like the subject, we need to focus more from the subject and not so much from the object. Basically, like in a world where AI, you can't tell the real and the fake, it's going to force us to look back at the subject because the objects are going to take on a different value at that point because we're not going to be able to tell the difference between an object and a non-object, so to speak. So I think with that said, in terms of the design versus deception thing that you brought up, Daniel, we are going to begin to design something, not knowing what we're going to design. And in the effort of trying to design something, we will get to the point of actually designing something through us deceiving ourselves in the process of it. We will be forgetting what we are designing while we're on the path. And it happens all the time in storytelling. Like from like Alex, all the time he's like, bro, you said that. I'm like, I did? Like, I don't even remember. Like, that's why I'm so pro don't write by yourself, because you will forget and others will remember for you and vice versa. And you will begin a conversation and not know where it started. You'll forget where it started. Just like you kind of, when you fall in love, like, sure, you might remember a glimpse of the exposition, but majority of it, you're like, you kind of forget. It just happened. It's like, bam, and now this is it. Like, I don't even know where to begin. Like, it's overwhelming to think about. And like, that's where the sequel emerges. Like, in the second, like in Toy Story 2, you kind of forgot about Toy Story 1. It's like, you're not necessarily thinking about the first story in order to be in that current story. Like a good sequel, you are forgetting the first movie. You're in the current movie. Like, it's just put you in the position to forget. That's how good the sequel is. So yeah, I mean, I want to say more, but I really want to hear what Chetan has to say, honestly.
Chetan's voice is just so beautiful. That man, that insight, that fire all around. I love what you said there on forgetting the sequel. And I think definitely there is a question. I wonder, like, when AI is able to like think and do all these things, is AI going to make like everything seem like math because we don't know its process, or is it realizing it or creating it? And will that help address this kind of sociological problem we have? Or at that point, will that ambiguity just feel, it won't feel special anymore? Like right now, that ambiguity of math has a way of making it be special to us. That ambiguity has a way of making storytelling, art be special to us. Would AI make everything special in that way? Or would it just make that feeling of the ambiguity just a source of anxiety to us, right? Like the black, Ebert will talk about the black box of AI and not knowing how it works. Could that be an apathetic source of like the human wondering how it goes on? Or we'll say, well, actually, it's just complex and it's irrelevant, right? Well, that seems to have a lot to do with the kind of subjectivity that's relating to it and the absolute choice you make in relation to that. And then how you have it reflect on your own life and your own preparation and your own designing of yourself in relation to that thing, as opposed to over-identifying with it, right? So then it's kind of the source of the theme, the command. Hey, you have to decide how you're going to live with this. You have to decide what this means, right? As opposed to the question of, what is it? Is it God in the kind of synthos, kind of bard stuff kind of way? Or is it something that's falling back on you? Which in a way, that's the Hegel move, right? Bringing back to the subject. How is AI for subjectivity? Like, what does it mean for subjectivity, for the subject, as opposed to replacing the subject? And that seems to be where it's the kind of paradigm of the storytelling possibility there. There's more to say, but let me give it to Mr. Chetan. Mr. Chetan, please.
Thank you so much. You guys are too kind, so I'll talk more. Thank you. Yeah, so well, a very interesting sort of response, I think, Daniel, what you're sort of discussing with logos and mythos. I might sort of maybe provocatively put this point across that the more we sort of depend upon simply logos for our activity, the more trapped in images we get. Paradoxically in that sense. And if you look at Lacan's Oedipal structure, the whole point about sort of getting images from the outside is that now that you can move into the symbolic, anchoring yourself as a subject in the symbolic in that sense. That's a journey with the neuropsychotic, neurotic, or perverse structure in that sense. And the problem happens that the more trapped in images we get, and the more sort of we depend upon rejection as a form of negation. The question of psychosis that we have been discussing for long, sort of in that space, and which is why the challenge for me these days has been to think subject in that sense within this matrix, because we've been thinking object for too long in that sense. That what happens onto the side of the subject within this matrix, that how the subject at any limit point gets trapped in images. There is a point when subject's only option becomes to reject the world. And capitalism is actually making that point come much more sooner for us. It's almost like even when we are very neurotic subjects and so on and so forth, our primary defense very quickly has become to reject the outside. And paradoxically, it is a psychotic structure, actually, which has a more open sense for this problem, because they have been struggling with it for the longest time. They have much better tools to deal with it. And which is where you can see a lot of work happening upon the melancholic, psychotic sort of interlinkages. And I've been trying to think about those questions. That there's something kind of an inversion happening over here, where the true stories of our times are actually emerging from the psychotic structure, the delusional sort of spaces. And the most dead, in some senses, spaces are the spaces where you are reaching this limit of your own capacity for negation very, very quickly. So you may be neurotically structured, you may be living in society and so on and so forth. But your immediate reaction for anything outside of the small world you created. So let's say I live in an apartment. There might be a slum next to my sort of building. I would have sort of negated all other things from. That is how urban life is getting structured more and more. That I would negate everything else that exists around me, apart from this little world that I structure for myself. There's hope in this also, undoubtedly. But there is a certain capacity to, in that sense, accelerate this process of rejecting the world, where you completely reject the world outside and you reject any motivation or meaning that can be generated from it. And you sort of push yourself back into your own self and trying to find some kind of replacement for that motivation that becomes possible because you're engaging with the outside in that sense. So I think we need to think subject. And somehow my sort of hope these days, and this is why I was sort of trying to write a paper for Kedal also, which I hope I'll write it. He'll kill me, but I will write it definitely. But that the space where this delusional structure sort of emerges, delusions, this complete break from this symbolic that we sort of being, that some kind of hope is happening on that front in some senses. There's a hope on the side of storytellers in that sense. Stories which are emerging from people struggle with this condition for a long time, which we all are collectively struggling with suddenly, yeah.
Absolutely brilliant. It gets at something I've been thinking through a lot. So and you're right on what you're saying. Logos creates imagery. And the imagery actually is part of the issue. So what's very interesting to me is the differences between, because it's all under aesthetics, the differences between the photograph, the architecture, the space in which you encounter community, music as a metaphor, because there's something about music with the cycle where everywhere you go, you can be, it doesn't matter what you experience, it's not really bound, but the image is more bound. But then there's the architectural space by which you encounter different people. And so you're kind of moved outside, because there's something about different aesthetic metaphors of which speak to different structures of the psyche, the different structures of the subject. And what ends up happening was very interesting is logos generates, the way I think of it, logos generates the photograph. And the logos, this kind of two-dimensional thing that's all kind of in the framework of your ideas, and the image that you see, and that's rational. What I am seeing confirms the rational, and it's stagnant. It doesn't really move. There's a kind of stagnancy to it. Whereas the problem with what seems to be the case is when we lose the environment, like the architecture where we're encountering, that's what works on our desires and love. And that determines what images we see. Like we go to the mall, which is more architectural. We see, I'll just use James K. Smith, we see the dress, and then we have our rationality in determining how to get the dress has images of us wearing it, and then we follow that, but that is formulated by our environment. And so what ends up happening is when we don't think the market society or the architecture or the common life of the community, then rationality creates images for itself that are created by itself, and it is not bound from something outside of itself, or it's formulated by power without you realizing it. And so I've been going through the arcades with Walter Benjamin, all of these kind of architectural, like Christopher, all of these different people, because there's something where we've in a way lost architecture as a structure, like environment as a structure. We're bound by a logocentricity to the photograph, to the two-dimensional, well, to the screen, right? And what we don't realize is that you don't really encounter the image. I mean, it's tricky. There is a sense in which you can be surprised by the image, but really the surprise requires an architectural space where you come upon something, especially another person, that formulates you in a way to maybe move out of your entrapment. And that isn't what we figured out how to do. So like you say, it's almost like the psychotic who's it's almost like the way I think about it is the psychosis is the person wearing earbuds, like headpieces, like music. Wherever they go, they got the music. It doesn't matter what they see. They're good. They're satisfied. They're in their own world. Where the neurotic doesn't have headbuds, but they're looking at their phone. Their phone, like the screen, the image or something. I'm not sure if this metaphorically works, but it's a way I've been thinking about it. You're in a way, the guy who has to look at their phone to have the image, the metaphor, is less well off than the guy who's got headphones and the music, and they can encounter things and they're ready to go because the music keeps going, so they're fine, right? But that works by shutting them off. Like they're in the music. They're oblivious to what's actually going on, right? But in a way, they're actually more so encountering the world than the person who's just looking at the image on their phone, right? So logos has us be image-based by customizable images, but it's actually the phone itself on which the screen is logos. In a way, the phone is logos that gives us the images of the screen. Whereas the psychotic with the earphones, the music cannot make the bookcase vanish in front of you, or whatever you encounter is there, right? Like it can't make that vanish. It can make you listen to music and maybe like see it in service of your psyche, but it doesn't make it that. Where if I'm looking at the images on the screen, I'm not looking at these things. I'm not encountering these things. So there's like more of a siloing that occurs with the image versus the music, right? So the question is the following. What would it look like to have a subjectivity that is able to be in a state of like flowness, like music, without it working by having headphones in, without it working by an obliviousness, and that kind of problematic flow that is at the disregard of the outside? And this is where, to me, what's so interesting with the Silence Indo book, what Matthew Stanley is bringing up, is there's the danger between the religion that is basically the father, neurotic, authority, all of that. But then there's actually a danger with the private religion that is inward, because that's like the psychotic, we just listen to music disregarding everything. No matter what's going on, I've got my personal relationship with Jesus, so it's okay. I've got the music, right? So that's a kind of psychotic structure that's going on. In a way, the psychotic is more able to handle pluralism. They're more able to handle diversity, because whatever they encounter, they've got their own personal belief and they can kind of incorporate it into the music. But in another way, it's not the full sublation. And that, to me, is where we have to think the architectural. Like it's almost like the image, the headphones, and the architecture, the space, with, of course, the net, the dialogos, and all of those other things, the common life that David Hume would talk about, that is moving more in an architectural direction as a form. Now, of course, in the architectural, there can be music and there can be images, so these things are not bad. It's almost like it's difficult. It's like the architectural, whatever the subjectivity is we're describing of the encounterology, can better entail imagery and music than the other two can entail the other ones, right? Like, and that's what we're finding ourselves faced with at this moment of history, thinking this kind of subjectivity. But metaphorically, like image, music, dance, architecture, spaces, these suggest different kinds of subjectivity that have to be thought, I think. And I appreciate you saying, but let me give it to Mr. Murphy here before I have to run out. I've really enjoyed this. It's been always a dream. Mr. Murphy, please.
I think the answer to what this kind of subjectivity looks like is Tom Bombadil.
Tolkien? Oh, yeah, man.
Yeah. Old Tom Bombadil.
Do we know the song? Can we sing it? Old Tom Bombadil, Bumba Bumba Bombadil, Bumba Bumba. No, I'm a psychotic, actually. Oh, Fred.
Old Tom Bombadil was a merry fellow, bright blue his jacket was, and his boots were yellow, green were his girdle, and his breeches all of leather. He wore in his tall hat a swan wing feather. He lived up on the hill where the withy window ran from grassy well down into the dingle. Anyways, the whole, I guess, I think he's an example of that, of what you were just talking about, because it's like in that poem, he encounters all of these different, problems, whether it's Goldberry or Old Man Willow or Old Badger Bruck and, or the Barrow White. And they all, try to grab him and take him away into their own things that they want him to do. And he just, through his words and his singing and stuff, I don't know, he continues to be a subject that walks to his own drum while still encountering otherness, and eventually, comes and grabs Goldberry and takes her off to be his wife. So that's a example of maybe who we all need to become like.
And so the world was saved. Thank you, Tyler. I appreciate it. Now we know. And Chetan went off to the forest, so we all know who Tom Bombadil is here, don't we? The truth is out. I've enjoyed it so much. Chetan Bombadil. It's so good. Thank you, Tom. Wink. Oh, I'm sorry, Chetan. Wink, wink. Ha! You were all awesome. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you so much.
Thank you all. Y'all rock.